everyone, I'm Nancy Clue from the Spy Rock Detective Agency. You might remember me from when I helped solve the case of the missing ingredient back at the Winter Family Getaway. Or I know many of you are familiar with the Spy Rock Focus Academy that I started over the summer. Well, as our team was wrapping up what has been a crazy year in so many ways for everyone, Spy Rock, Candy Cane, and I thought it might be interesting to share some of our craziest cases of 2020. Today, I'll get us started with the case of the terrified Terry. So, I first met Terry when he called the Spy Rock Detective Agency looking for a disguise. I told him we weren't a store, we were a detective agency. And he said he knew that and figured detectives would be great at disguises, and he needed a good one right away. I asked what the disguise was for, and he said it was to protect him from his new neighbor. I figured his new neighbor must be some kind of criminal, so I told him we should call the police instead of hiding in a disguise to avoid him. But Terry said his neighbor wasn't the criminal, he was, and he had to get a disguise so his neighbor couldn't catch him. Since I don't work for criminals, I told Terry he better start from the beginning and explain the whole story. Apparently, it all started when Terry's neighbor moved into the biggest, nicest house on their street. He and his brother had fun watching the movers bring in a ton of super nice furniture, and they were especially amazed by the cool sports car their new neighbor pulled up in. It was shiny, cool, and in perfect condition. After he pulled up, he introduced himself. His name was Manny, which was short for Emmanuel, and Terry and his brother thought he seemed just as perfectly awesome as all his stuff. Later that afternoon, Terry and his brother were playing football, and Terry told his brother to throw him the deepest pass he possibly could. Sure enough, his brother launched a throw that Terry knew he could catch, but he had to run his fastest while also tracking the ball over his shoulder. The pass looked like it might just sail right over his head, and thinking back, Terry wished he'd just let it. But instead, Terry decided to jump up and dive for it. He thought he was still on the grass in one of their neighbors' yards, but he had miscalculated, and it turns out that instead of landing on the ground, Terry landed right on Manny's shiny, perfect sports car. Except now it wasn't perfect anymore. Thankfully, the car was a convertible, and Terry landed safely in the back seat. But on his way in, his foot slammed against the side and left a huge dent. When Terry got out and saw what had happened to the car, he was so scared of getting in trouble, he just took off running. He went home, and after thinking for a few minutes, he decided to get a detective to help disguise him so he wouldn't get caught. Once I got the full story, I suggested that Terry just go and confess what had happened. But Terry was terrified of his perfect new neighbor and all of his perfect stuff. He was sure Manny would be really mad and mean about what had happened. Someone that perfect would never put up with someone who had done something so bad to his car. So he just wanted a disguise to stay hidden. I wasn't really following the logic of how a disguise would help Terry, but I did have an idea of how a disguise could help me help Terry. When I suggested it to Terry, he wasn't sure initially, but he decided to let me give it a try. So, the next morning, I showed up at Manny's house looking, well, let me show you my new quick change skills I learned from Candy Cane. Like this! I knocked on the door and introduced myself as Polly from Perfect Painters R Us. I offered to paint one room of his new house for free to welcome him to the area and give him a taste of my perfect painting skills. He was quite friendly and said he'd love to see my painting skills. So I got started right away on his downstairs bathroom. I worked as a painter in college, so I knew I could do a great job, but I purposefully left some pretty bad drips on his perfectly clean floor to see what Manny would say. When he came to inspect it, he first told me how great it looked, but then he noticed the drips and ran off. I thought he might have been mad, but instead he just came back with a rag and cleaned it up himself. As he was cleaning, he told me that when he paints, he leaves way more drips, so he was happy to clean up a few of mine. When I went back to Terry to let him know his neighbor handled my mistakes great, Terry felt a little better, but then Terry said that while I was gone, he had started thinking about how Manny wasn't just perfect, but he was also strong. There was no way Terry could confess what he had done to someone who could pick him up and throw him across the yard with one arm tied behind his back. I tried to assure Terry that wouldn't happen, but he still just wanted a disguise. So again, I had to convince him to let me use a different disguise to help him out. He agreed, so the next day I went to Manny's gym dressed like this. When I found Manny, I watched him lift some really huge weights. He was definitely strong, but when he finished, I introduced myself as Rita, the rookie, explaining I was trying a new workout and needed some help. He could have just told me to figure it out myself since we were clearly in totally different leagues in terms of strength, but he stopped his workout right away and spent an hour teaching me all sorts of new exercises. I was sure letting Terry know about the experience would help him feel fine about confessing, but then Terry decided that even if Manny could handle him not being perfect or strong, he would ultimately just think Terry was dumb for not seeing the car and putting the dent in it. Thankfully, I love disguises and was happy to try one more to help Terry. The next day, I followed Manny to his favorite coffee shop looking like this. I introduced myself as Connie the Confused and explained I was supposed to meet a friend at some coffee shop in the area, but I had slept in late and forgotten my phone and could not remember whether I was even at the right coffee shop. Manny was quite understanding and offered me his phone right away to help me figure things out. I was glad to go back to Terry a third time and report that even though Manny seemed super perfect, strong, and smart, he was also understanding, caring, and helpful. And that finally gave Terry the courage to do what he knew he wanted to do from the beginning. He went over to Manny and confessed what had happened. And guess what? Manny said he already knew Terry had put the dent in his car. He had been enjoying watching Terry and his brother throw the football and had seen the whole thing. He figured it would be hard for Terry to have to confess something like that to someone he hardly knew, so he decided to just wait until they got to know each other better. He was very glad Terry had come faster than expected since they hadn't talked since that first day. But Terry felt so comfortable, he told Manny all about how he was friends with Polly, Rita, and Connie, and they had some great laughs about how I had used my disguises to help Terry get to know more about his new neighbor. And that was the case of the terrified Terry. Oh, and now I guess I can go back to looking like this. Well, Nancy Clue signing off on part 1 of the Spy Rock Detective Agency's craziest cases of 2020. But be sure to check out part 2 and part 3 with Spy Rock and Candy King's crazy cases. They're great too. Bye everyone!